We're joined by Bloomberg contributing editor Bill Cohan here on set with me. His latest book, Money and Power, looks at the rise of Corzine's former firm, Goldman Sachs. Also with us, former SEC Commissioner Harvey Pitt, now CEO of Calorama Partners. And at the studio, last but not least, Washington executive editor Al Hunt. Thank you all for being here. Now, in this testimony we saw from John Corzine today, it was a surprise to see that he's making any statement. Some thought that he would even plead the fifth. Commissioner Pitt, I mean, what is your reaction to what he has explained thus far?
Well, I think he's tried to walk a very thin line. I think ultimately it's not going to be successful, but I think you have to give him credit for the effort. He's basically saying, I really wasn't part of this, I didn't know about any of this, and I'm not going to hide behind the Fifth Amendment to say that.
He says all that, yet explains the bets that he was supporting being taken, wrong way bets on European debt, and says, oh, the board knew this, by the way. But I don't know the accounting specifics of where the customer money went. Knowing Wall Street as you do, does that make sense for a CEO to explain things that way?
It does make sense for him to explain it that way. It doesn't absolve him of any blame for it, but yes, sort of hiding behind the board, and I'm at a level where I can't get down in the weeds, and that I'm, reporting to the board, and the board was well aware. And, oh, by the way, I wasn't doing this on my own. The board and the other executives were well aware of this. Yes, I was an advocate of it. But, what he doesn't address in this testimony, all 21 pages of it, although he does appear to be somewhat contrite in it all, he doesn't address why they would risk the company by financing themselves in the short-term markets with a relatively long-term bet. And he admits that is all confidence-based, and to not talk about why these smart guys, a guy who was former senior partner of Goldman Sachs and partnered with Chris Flowers,
right,
a former senior partner of Goldman Sachs as well, to do that when they knew the risks involved is unconscionable.
Commissioner Pitt, when you read through the testimony this morning from John Corzine, how did you interpret his explanation?
Well, I first thought that this was the old approach of the four-monkey defense. I didn't see anything, I didn't hear anything, I didn't say anything, and I certainly didn't understand anything. That was supposed to have gone out the window with Sarbanes-Oxley, so it's very disturbing. Second, he hides behind complex accounting rules, and there's no doubt that the rules here are very complex. But one thing that isn't complex is, if it's your customer's money, not yours, you can't touch it. Whatever the rules were, they had to have known that that was not their money to use. And so I find that while this is a very good PR effort, I think as a matter of substance, it doesn't really give us any insight.
Right, and in that testimony, he really doesn't explain some of what you're talking about, that commingling of funds, saying there are some accounting issues that I'm not, able to get information on right now. And that's really what Main Street wants to know, is where'd our money go? But Bill Cohan, I mean, as a CEO coming from Goldman Sachs, the sort of gold standard here, should we assume that the oversight and the regulation inside of MF Global was comparable? Are we underweighting incompetence, I guess is what I'm asking you?
I think there was a high level of incompetence here, because there's no way, and then in researching in my book, I spent a lot of time with John Corzine at the MF Global offices. He was very clear at how inadequate their oversight and internal controls were, and as well as, frankly, how inadequate the risk-taking was. He was all about how he was going to ramp up the risk-taking at MF Global, which he clearly did, unfortunately. But there was no question that MF Global did not have nearly the controls that he was used to at Goldman Sachs. I mean, it was a totally different, even though he wanted to be like Goldman Sachs, and even though in his testimony he said that, the board of directors and Bain Capital or Bain Consulting or BCG Consulting approved this whole new direction that the company was going, this was a far, far cry from Goldman Sachs. And it's clearly, inadequate in every possible way.
But whose fault does that ultimately become? Because this is an era in which we are looking at Dodd-Frank, we are looking at legislation that was supposed to fix what was wrong with the financial crisis, but we're still talking about lack of, monitoring of risk, over leverage, undercapitalization, and then this next new element, commingling of accounts.
I think the positive news out of all of this is there's plenty of blame to go around. You can find many people to blame, but the real question is, how do we fix the situation for those who were investors in MF Global, and then how do we prevent this again? And one of the most important elements of preventing this is something that Congress can't legislate. It's inherent honesty and integrity of the people who run these financial services firms. And if the person in charge doesn't have that integrity, Congress's efforts will be all for naught.